Welcome to part 7 of A Cartoonist Guide to the Gospel of Mark. In this video, we are continuing our journey through this gospel as we finish up part 1. Last video, we looked at the beginning of chapter 6, where we saw that John the Baptist was beheaded. And so today, in this video, we look at page 9, starting in chapter 6, verse 30, and we're going to go all the way through the end of part 1 and jump here into part 2, end up on the Mount of Transfiguration. So let's dive in. After they heard the news that John the Baptist had been beheaded, and after they had done their ministry of going the 12 out 2 by 2, we see, let's walk down here to the PowerPoint. We see that Jesus and his disciples, they retreat to a deserted place, but the crowd, he can't shake the crowd from this point on in the Gospel of Mark. And so he's like, hey, these people, they need to eat. They are hungry. The disciples are telling Jesus they need to eat. And Jesus says, you feed them. And they're like, how are we going to do that? And Jesus asks, how much food do you have? He's got, well, we've got 5 loaves of bread and 2 little fish. And Jesus said, man, that'll work. And so he gathers the people together, and here he feeds 5,000 men plus women and children that were there, and everyone has enough to eat. And they go around and they pick up leftover baskets, and there are 12 baskets of leftovers. That's an amazing story. And then Jesus sends his disciples on ahead of him. Well, he gets away to pray. And while he is praying in the middle of the night, a storm kicks up and the disciples are terrified. And so Jesus walks out to them on the water in the middle of the storm and says, it is I, don't be afraid. And then he calms the storm and he's like, hey guys, what's going on? And then when they get to the shore on the other side, they are moored in the region of Gennesaret. And there, those who are sick and possessed come to him, they flock to him, and he heals them. And this is an amazing continuation of Jesus' ministry. So that is page 9. So let's now go to page 10, Mark chapter 7, verses 1 through 23. We'll come down here and walk through the PowerPoint. So while Jesus is in that region, the Pharisees and the scribes come to him and they ask him, why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands? So for some reason, Jesus' disciples are not washing their hands properly according to the laws of the Pharisees and the scribes. And so Jesus says, Isaiah was right about you. This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition. So Jesus is calling out the religious leaders here, and he gives them this parable of sorts. He says, Moses said to honor your father and mother. That's the law, right? But you find a legal loophole to get out of it, thus making void the word of God through your tradition that you have handed down. So Jesus is making some big accusations here about how the religious leaders are distorting the law for their own purposes. So then Jesus addresses the crowd in verse 14. He says, listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. And then I love this part. Jesus says, do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart, but the stomach, and goes out into the sewer? Yes, he is talking about the digestive system. So food can't make you unclean. Thus he declared all foods clean. However, it is what comes out of a person that defiles, for it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these things come from within, and they defile a person. So Jesus is really, this is Mark's version of Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, where Matthew's Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, but I say to you." Here, Mark is saying, the Pharisees and the scribes are upset because Jesus' disciples, they don't practice the ceremonial washing of their hands before they eat. The ritual washing was not specifically stated in the law of Moses, but it had become a tradition of the Pharisees that was as binding to them as the law itself. And Jesus uses this opportunity to lambaste the Pharisees for their hypocritical distortion of the law. And then moving down verses 14 through 15, it's obvious that Jesus did not want to limit his teaching to this topic to the Pharisees that attacked him. He quickly turns to the ever-present crowd and disrupts their worldview even further. So who knows if they understood him? His disciples obviously did not understand him. Thus, he turns to his disciples and he gives them this teaching about what comes from the inside. So Jesus takes his befuddled disciples into private once again to explain his teaching. He makes two key moves. First, the key to this passage is the phrase, "Thus he declared all foods clean." This is a radical teaching that we see pushes further with the Apostle Peter in Acts chapter 10, when God said, "Don't call unclean what I have made clean." And the second move shifts the focus of uncleanness from externals to internals. It's not the outward things like food or disease or ethnicity that make someone clean. It is the heart. An evil heart spews forth evil. So is Jesus condemning all people in this passage because all people have evil in their heart? I don't think so. It makes more sense to see that Jesus is showing that the supposedly righteous religious leaders are not righteous because they follow external rituals. They can look good on the outside, but be rotten on the inside. Jesus is simply leveling the playing field. Dr. Angela Deanhart Hancock says the world Jesus invites us to see has no quarantines, no holding cells, no decontamination chambers. So he eats with sinners and tax collectors, touches lepers, handles dead bodies, preaches to pig farmers, and in the text that follows this one has a deep conversation with a pagan woman. Nothing can keep Jesus away from them, or from the Pharisees who clearly drive him a little bit crazy, or from the disciples who persist in uncomprehension, or hear this, from us. And when he declares that all people are clean and unclean, there is no one is better than the other because they belong to a particular classification of humans. We are all a mixed bag of the beautiful image of God and the brokenness of human evil. So the good news is for all people. Let's move on to Mark chapter 7, verse 24. And here we see that Jesus now moves northward to the region of Syria and Phoenicia, and he meets a woman, a Gentile woman, a syro-phonecian who is in Tyre. And she asks Jesus to cast the demon from her daughter. And Jesus says a very perplexing thing. "Should I throw the children's food to the dogs?" And the woman says, "Even dogs eat the children's scraps." And Jesus says, "Your daughter is healed." This is a perplexing story. We'll come to it in a minute. Now, he moves from Syria, Phoenicia, around to the Decapolis, where we have been before. And here he finds a man who is deaf and mute. And he touches his tongue and he opens his mouth. But then he says, "Don't tell anyone." It's like, now you can speak, but don't tell anyone, which is really interesting. But the man proclaims and the crowd gathers. And so now we have a different crowd. We have another crowd who is hungry, but they are the crowd in the Decapolis. And so Jesus says, "I love these people. Let's feed them." And Peter's like, "How? How many loaves do you have?" Once again, we have 7 loaves. Jesus said, "That'll work." And then Jesus feeds the 4,000 in the Decapolis, and there are 7 baskets of bread left over. Then he moves from the Decapolis back across the Sea of Galilee, into a Jewish region, and he encounters religious leaders in Dalmanutha. And they accuse Jesus and test him, and they say, give us a sign from heaven. It's like, you're doing all these things, give us a sign from heaven. And Jesus said, no, I'm not going to do it. So then they move across now to the northern shore once again, and Jesus tells his disciples, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. And they're like, is he mad because we ran out of bread? And he's like, can't you see what I'm saying yet? Like, didn't I just feed like 2 crowds? Bread is not my problem. And then there in Bethsaida, Jesus encounters a blind man and it makes the blind man able to see. And now the blind man says, I see everything. And that is this section of the story. And I think what's going on in this section is Jesus is expanding his boundaries. He's moving out of just Galilee, and he's starting to encounter people who are different. And when he encounters this woman up here in Syria and Phoenicia, the syro-phonecian woman, she challenges his ethnic boundaries. And because of her faith and her tenaciousness, Jesus realizes, I've got to move beyond just the children of Israel. And so the very next thing Mark does is moves us to the Decapolis, where he feeds non-Jewish people in the same way that he fed the Jewish people with the feeding of the 5,000. And he encounters a man who can't speak. So he makes those who can't speak able to speak. And then when he goes to the religious leaders back in the Jewish section, they still can't see him for who he is, so he's not going to give them a sign. But then when he gets to Bethsaida, there's a man who can't see, who actually sees Jesus for who he is, and now he can see. So I think Mark is playing with a lot of themes about who can speak, who can't speak, who can see, who can't see, and who is actually included in the kingdom of heaven. So it's a really important section of the Gospel of Mark, which now leads us to a transitional moment where we come to this famous story of the Transfiguration. So let's walk through this. In chapter 8, verse 27, it starts with Jesus moving from the Sea of Galilee up way north to the area of Caesarea Philippi. And while he's there, he asks his disciples, who do people say that I am? And they respond, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, some say you're one of the prophets. But Jesus asks them this important question, who do you say that I am? Well, the disciples declare, you are the Messiah. And then Jesus again strangely says, don't tell anybody that I'm the Messiah. And then he turns to his disciples and he says, the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And Peter's like, no, that not on my watch. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. And then in verse 34, he speaks to the crowd and he says, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. So Jesus realizes at this point in the journey that he is going to die, and anyone who follows him is going to suffer the same fate. 6 days later, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John to the top of a mountain, and there he is transfigured before them, and they see him standing and talking with Moses and Elijah, the 2 most prominent prophets from the Hebrew story. And Peter says, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Peter doesn't know what he's talking about. And then a dark cloud descends on them and says, this is the beloved. This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him. And then in verse 8, everything disappears and it's just plain old Jesus again. And they go down the mountain. I have a little bit of commentary I want to reflect on. I've got a different set of images that I did for this Caesarea Philippi, who do you say that I am section? And so there are three interesting facts about this city. It's named after Caesar, the emperor of Rome. And when a herald would come into a village to give a message from the emperor, he would begin, "A message from Caesar, the Son of God." This is the most powerful man in the empire. It's also named after Philip the Tetrarch, and he was the son of Herod the Great. You remember Herod the Great? He was the king of Israel when Jesus was born. He's the one who had all the babies slaughtered in Bethlehem in hopes that he would kill Jesus in the process. So this city in this region was also known as Paneas. It was named after the Greek god Pan, and he's the one who is half goat and half human and plays the pipes. Roman called him Faunus. He was the god of wild places and nature. You see what's happening here? This is not an Orthodox Jewish village. This city represents all of the power structures of the Roman Empire and how they imposed themselves upon the Jewish people. You have the Roman Empire, the king of Israel, who is a complete puppet of the empire, and the Greco-Roman religion of the power of nature. Also notice how far north it is. Caesarea Philippi was about as far away from Jerusalem, both geographically and theologically, as one could get within Jewish territories. So Jesus looks around at all these symbols of the world's power and asks, "Who do people say that I am?" Well, Jesus, some say you're John the Baptist. Others say you're Elijah. The others think that you are one of the prophets. Then Jesus stops, looks them in the eye, and asks them one of the most important questions ever asked in the history of the universe. Who do you say that I am? Most people who flocked to Jesus during his season of popularity, they just wanted something out of him. They were hungry, so they wanted food. They were sick, so they wanted to be healed. They were oppressed, so they wanted someone to deliver them. What do we want from God? Do we really know who the Christ is? Jesus responded, "Ah, yes, there is that word again. I do not think it means what you think it means." Yes, that was a Princess Bride reference. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. This is what the Christ looks like. Is that what you think a great leader looks like? That's the whole purpose of the Gospel of Mark. This story helps us to understand what God's kind of power looks like in contrast to the world's kind of power. And then we come to the main event. Things just got real. That's why I think Jesus took Peter, James, and John to the top of the mountain. Jesus was transfigured. It says that his clothes were brighter than any bleach could bleach. He stood there with Elijah and Moses, the two greatest leaders of Israel's history. Then a dark cloud covered the mountain. This is just like the time Moses went to the top of Mount Sinai to receive the law. Then a voice came from the cloud. "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." This happened once before when Jesus was baptized and the sky was torn open. Do you know why I think this happened? To give the disciples a glimpse. Jesus was asking them to take a very dangerous and terrifying path. He was about to make his journey to Jerusalem where he would be executed. This glimpse into the truth of who Jesus is was just what the disciples needed to have hope for this journey. It will be worth it, Jesus says. I promise. And then just as quickly as the glimpse appeared, it was gone. Just plain Jesus, a human being that was about to suffer unimaginable pain. And he asks, "Are you ready to follow?"